Meanwhile, the United Nations Security Council has held a briefing on the humanitarian situation. The number of refugees fleeing the Russian invasion of Ukraine has now increased to 2 million in 12 days, including hundreds and thousands of children.
The number of refugees, mostly women and children, continue to rise exponentially, with the EU leadership warning the bloc could see the arrival of 5 million Ukrainians, what senior UN officials are now calling the fastest growing refugee crisis in Europe since World War II.
Simply put, millions of lives shattered. People can't stay home with shops shut, power and water cut, shells falling, phones switched off. They can't find what they need, even if they have money to pay for it. And as we have seen, even as the TV cameras roll, many can't flee in safety either in this conflict. It's been 11 days of escalating violence, fear and pain. As of 6th of March, the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights reported at least 1,207 civilian casualties, including at least 406 dead, and I guess the real figure could be considerably higher.
The UN is calling for 3 immediate priorities to lessen the suffering on the ground. First, that parties take constant care to spare civilians and civilian homes and infrastructure, the need for safe passage for humanitarian supplies in areas where active hostilities are ongoing, and the urgent need to enable a system of constant communication to support those aid deliveries.
What is happening to children in Ukraine is a moral outrage. Images of a mother and her 2 children and a friend lying dead on the street, hit by a mortar as they tried to flee to safety, must shock the conscience of the world. We must act to protect children from this brutality. UNICEF calls upon the members of this council to remind all parties of their legal and moral obligation to protect children and spare them from attack.
As the wider implications of yet another unnecessary war become clearer.
I'm deeply worried about the consequences on vulnerable people living half a world away. Food prices are spiking, supplies are uncertain. We didn't need that either. People in the Sahel, in Yemen, the Horn of Africa, Afghanistan, Madagascar, and already face profound food insecurity. Record-level fuel prices means life becomes harder still in places like Lebanon, where generators keep hospitals open and water treatment plants working.
This as negotiations continue over agreed humanitarian corridors for Ukrainians to safely exit some of the hardest hit cities. This latest humanitarian briefing coming in the context of ongoing negotiations in the Council on a French and Mexican-led draft resolution on unimpeded humanitarian access into Ukraine. The drafters urged the Security Council, where Russia sits with veto power, to assume its responsibility and put an end to the unfolding humanitarian tragedy. Mexico's ambassador telling us that they are working to keep the text 100% humanitarian focused so that the draft achieves its purpose amid concerns that a veto could yet again undermine the Council's broad consensus on the situation in Ukraine. Sherman Bryce-Pease, SABC News, New York.
The number of refugees, mostly women and children, continues to rise exponentially, with the EU leadership warning the bloc could see the arrival of 5 million Ukrainians, what senior UN officials are now calling the fastest growing refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. Now let's discuss this and the impact of armed conflict on especially women and children and girls. We're now joined by Southern Africa Unhcr spokesperson Laura Paduan. Laura, thank you so much for your time this afternoon.
Good afternoon, thank you.
It is perhaps today, it being Women International Day, that does put a spotlight on just how vulnerable women are, particularly in a time of war. Perhaps, just describe what you are currently hearing and seeing in terms of how grave the situation is, particularly for women and children.
That's right. It's an incredibly grave situation. The humanitarian situation in Ukraine is increasingly dire. We've seen figures today that 2 million refugees have now fled Ukraine into neighboring Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, and Moldova. And nearly 1 million people are internally displaced inside Ukraine. It's an exodus. Rarely have we seen an exodus on this scale, and it's incredibly alarming. The vast majority of the refugees are women and children. They've often experienced hardships in leaving the country and are arriving cold, tired, desperate, hungry, with very, very little with them. So UNHCR and our partners are rushing to deliver aid to neighbouring countries and to support the refugees there.
You know, in one of, the UN's briefing, one of the executive directors of the organization was saying that what we are currently seeing on the ground is a moral humanitarian crisis. I know that the UN has immediate, interventions that it would like to see, and to see that immediately. One of them is obviously the sparing of civilians and infrastructure. But what we have been seeing on our television screens is indiscriminate, shelling of infrastructure. I mean, one analyst actually described this a war against civilians.
That's right. We are seeing civilians being targeted and civilian infrastructure being targeted. And what that has meant is that people are being left without power, without food, without water, and without basic supplies necessary to sustain human life. Now, President Zelensky has announced this afternoon that a child has died due to dehydration. And sadly, we will see further loss of life if UN agencies aren't allowed to access civilians to provide them with the necessary aid. Currently, the security situation is severely hampering humanitarian efforts inside the country. First and foremost, our concern is with the safety of our staff. They are staying and delivering. We are ramping up our assistance that we're giving to people who aren't able to leave Ukraine, and we're setting up temporary accommodation centres. But of course, civilians do need to be protected. There has been an announcement of humanitarian corridors, and that's very welcome. We need parties to respect the civilian and humanitarian nature of those spaces so that we can get aid to people where it's needed, people who are suffering desperately, women and children under immense strain who may need to leave for desperate medical and humanitarian reasons. There needs to be safe passage for those people.
Now, one of the other things that you are calling, I mean, you mentioned the humanitarian supplies that are desperately needed. What do we know currently about those corridors that were meant to be created? We understand now some are available, and that is why, some people are then allowed to leave the country. What is happening currently from your organization, particularly, that are currently inside the Ukraine in terms of those corridors, those safe corridors for most people who still want to leave?
Well, it's reported that corridors have been established from towns such as Sumy, from Irpin, and from Kharkiv. That was the latest that we heard this morning. Obviously, the situation is very, very volatile, very dynamic. People are also very scared to leave. They are worried that even though corridors have been announced, that they still may be in danger if they are fleeing their homes. So that's why it's absolutely imperative that the attacks are stopping so that civilians aren't at risk and that they can access safety. People will become increasingly desperate as supplies run out. To carry on without food, water and electricity is increasingly difficult. So we're very, very concerned about the safety and welfare, especially of very vulnerable elderly people who may have medical conditions and young children.
Just to digress a little bit, Laura, this war in the Ukraine has been described as the fastest growing refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. It's perhaps this statement that has drawn attention to other war-torn countries where this statement also applied about 4 years or so ago, like in Yemen, for instance, where there are roughly 7 million people who are starving to death and around 12 million facing starvation in other countries like Somalia, Nigeria and South Sudan. How can global relief groups attend to these situations simultaneously as the one that we are seeing now currently in Eastern Europe?
Well, yes, you're very, very right to raise the issue that around the world we have many millions of people whose lives are at risk, who are suffering, who are at risk of famine, drought, and human rights abuses, and people who have fled their homes, who are living in refugee camps often for decades. Right now, the world's cameras and the spotlight is on Ukraine. That does not mean that we should forget about the refugees here in Africa who have fled conflict in Somalia, in DRC, in Mozambique. We need to maintain the global spotlight on those refugees so that we ensure that there is support from the international community, that we do receive funding, that their needs aren't forgotten as well. Right now, the emergency in Ukraine, we are delivering life-saving assistance to people who are on the ground, and many of the neighbouring countries to Ukraine are themselves coming forward, and people are donating very generously. We need to make sure that in the long term, the needs of refugees around the world aren't forgotten.
Fantastic. Laura, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Really do appreciate it.
Thank you.